This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so we're recording the meeting so people can watch online. What we're finding is people will access online, so it's good to have this information available. We also typically will follow up with surveys and online engagement. So that's part of the reason why we have the recordings. So thank you for coming tonight. This is our third meeting of the landscapes plan. The first meeting was just kind of the initial kickoff where we looked at why and where. Why do we want to preserve and where should we preserve? We had a map exercise during that. And then the next meeting was the agriculture resource meeting. We had a fantastic panel, local farmer, a local small business owner, and I guess a farmer from the seed farm, so a incubator farm, and a consultant for Rodale. And buy fresh, buy local. So it was really good engagement, really good discussion. And what we're really trying to do during this next set of meetings is to talk about the what and the who. So what's important to preserve and who can we work with, who should we work with moving forward. So tonight we're going to cover natural resources. We did a lot of the natural resource work during the comprehensive plan. And that's kind of what led us to begin to look at things from a landscape perspective, because we had all these overlays of GIS mapping that we did. And as you stack the layers, you started to see common areas or areas that were more important to preserve than others. And what we've also seen is a lot of open space plans will typically focus on one item in particular. So right now we're really trying to focus on how do we preserve everything that's important together holistically. So that's why we're looking at it as landscapes. The next meeting we have is historic resources. And then in October, we hope to have a draft plan to present and to go over some of the goals and strategies and tools that we can use for preservation. So tonight we have Chris Stroller. I didn't introduce myself. Dave Manhart, Director of Community Development. Chris Stroller, the long range planner for the township. We have Chris Kocher from Wildlands, and Marie North, a resident and Green Advisory Committee / Environmental Advisory Committee member. So we're going to go over some of the natural resources, what we've come across during the comprehensive plan, and then talk about some of the importance of it. We have a small group, so by all means, if you have any questions during it, feel free to ask. With that, I will.
Thank you. Just kind of do a quick plug here for the photo survey that we still have open. Again, you can access this on the township website and submit your photos of your favorite places in the township. This is great for us to not only hear from everyone about what they want to preserve, but actually see it. Thank you to those who have already submitted photos. It's been wonderful. We're going to do another quick poll with the audience. So we are going to, if you can pull out your smartphone and go to menti.com and type in the following code 54879035. And for those of you online, you can do the same. And we're just going to ask a couple quick questions. And as you're going through that, I will open up the poll. So the first question we're asking, what are natural resources? When you hear that in your mind, what do you think of? So you can type in any responses. I believe if you type in multiple words, you need to separate them by a period. There we go. And we really like using these polls because we can kind of revisit some of the things we talked about before we get into the individual resource assessment, and then reflect and look back and see what people thought about initially, if they learned anything, if there's areas that we didn't cover. Yeah, you should be able to do 10 responses, but you have to submit them all. Did you submit it already? I have it open. If what words did you want to add? Open. Okay. The next question, what are the benefits of natural resources? So again, you can submit up to 10 responses and enter in all your 10 responses before hitting submit. To be fair, this is different than we had it last time because it was open-ended, because we had a bigger audience, a lot more things happening. Did everybody submit? Oh, there we go. Yeah, I noticed that you can put in a space now. Okay. And the final question, who benefits from natural resources? And if you remember, if there's multiple submissions of the same word, the word gets larger. So we're seeing wildlife, everyone, community, those must have been submitted multiple times. Okay. I think everyone has submitted. Thank you, everyone, for participating in that. Like I mentioned, those are really helpful for us to go through and document.
And one of the things we're going to use them for is we're going to try and incorporate them into the plan, look for common themes between all of the answers as we're going. So the idea is to get these answers and kind of put them all together to incorporate it into the final plan. Thank you.
Okay. So again, tonight is all about natural resources. So the first question is, what do we consider natural resources? It can be pretty open-ended. Really, we look at anything that's a physical material found in nature, created by nature. Tonight, we're going to talk really about 4 specific categories of natural resources, things that are relevant to the township. We want to look at woodlands, topography, hydrology, and really all of that comes together to create habitat. So first, woodlands, what do we mean by this? It's really the areas of trees and shrubs. If you see the map here, we have already mapped and identified some of the woodlands in the township. About 14% of the township is actually covered in what we consider woodlands. And there's 3 really kind of crucial categories of woodlands. And each of those categories have different management strategies, different preservation strategies. That's core forest, what we're calling the near edge forest, and then edge forest. So core forest is what you think about when you think of a large intact forest. These are areas usually of larger acreages. You'll see a lot more mature trees. It's usually typically shaded because of the tree canopy blocking out the sun. This really provides a very stable habitat for animals, for shelter, and a reliable food source. And this supports really natural interactions between predators and prey. Core forests are probably the most significant when talking about preservation, to preserve in larger acreages to maintain that species, the same species of trees throughout a large area. Near edge forest is really what we think of as the transitional zone. So as it gets out of the mature forest, we're looking at seeing some more scrubby and shrubs and things like that. You won't see as much as mature growth. These are towards the edges of forest. You'll see a lot more biodiversity here because you have the opportunity for usually birds or smaller animals or different types of animals who live in these spaces or maybe come to this area location to forage for food. And it's really more of your successional species. Again, your lower canopy grasses and mixtures of shrubs and herbaceous perennials. And then you have right on the outside the edge forest. So this is really the boundary between what we consider our major forest areas and a different type of land cover. These can be natural. A lot of times you'll see this whether there's a drastic change in soil characteristics or in if there was a fire, a forest fire that went through an area. A lot of times, though, these are man-made, whether it's either for agricultural purposes or roadways cutting through or development. And usually in the human influenced edge forest, you'll see a lot more invasive species and there's less of a transition through there. Now, there are some benefits to edge forest as far as habitat diversity and biodiversity, because this is really where you'll see interactions of different types of animal species that are coming from where their habitat may not be in the forest, but they're coming to the forest either for food, whether they're hunting something, or for shelter, and vice versa. The other, yeah, go ahead. So the last piece that we like to talk about, so that when those forest types are really kind of more of our intact forest areas, larger acreages, but especially important to South Whitehall Township, we need to consider what's really referred to as the urban forest. And even though it's the term urban forest, this really just means everything outside of the fully undeveloped areas. This is where we talk about our street trees, our parks, our green spaces around other types of development. Um, the urban forest is really probably one of the most critical features for a suburban community to look at and consider as far as the health and biodiversity, because these are the areas that we're getting the most out of our forest in the greater part of the township. The U.S. Forest Service talks about urban forests coming in all kinds of shapes and sizes, but how important they are and how they form the green infrastructure of an area.
So I figure we could stop and talk about each of the resources as we go. Chris, if you could just go back to the map. So the way the map was generated, it's based off of what's called land cover data set. So it's a satellite imagery combined with LiDAR. So that gives you elevations. So it's really good tool to measure tree canopy. And the one thing that's kind of missing out of this map is really the urban forest, because, the resolution of that data set can identify single trees. So it gets pretty complex when you start doing an analysis on it. But I think one of the things that we may look at is kind of identifying and really talking about shade trees and using that data set to help identify where these shade trees are, is one of the things that I think we'll do. And then just another thing that I noticed on the next slide, and Chris kind of touched on it, one of the things that you notice in this slide is there's not a lot of undergrowth or understory. It's really open because that canopy is so thick in the core forest. So those were a couple things that I noticed. Anybody have any questions or comments? Or I know Marie's trying to hold back from talking about the forward stewardship program. Yes, Diane. So the question was, of the 14%, what category is the majority? It's probably edge forest.
Yeah, 1,300 acres is considered edge forest. And I think that's mostly influenced by, you can see on the map, the areas where we have kind of these like linear strips of forest lands. This is where Dave talked about the kind of the granular data set. It is picking up more of our street trees if they're really compacted into an area. But because they're almost stands of individual trees or linear stands of individual trees, they wouldn't compromise enough to be core forest. You can see kind of the pockets of our forests are mostly in the Jordan Valley, in areas that are undeveloped and not really in agricultural use. And that being said, the importance of core forest is great, but in a suburban municipality, we don't really expect much core forest at all. And that's kind of where we highlight the urban forest and kind of the mechanisms and attention to that. I don't know if Chris or Marie want to talk a little bit about kind of the importance of woodlands. I think one of the things we often, you can't go wrong with planting trees. We talk about it for carbon storage. We talk about it for kind of cleaning our air, certainly from a habitat perspective, and just kind of increasing biodiversity in our neighborhoods as well. I know Maria will certainly talk later about her kind of her own core forest at her house. So. If there's no other questions on woodlands, we'll move on to topography. So really, this is kind of the lay of the land, really the how the land is formed, the physical features of that, some of the things that we have in the township: hills, valleys. We don't really have any what's considered mountains, ponds, and certainly our stream corridors. We talk a lot about the Jordan Valley, the Huckleberry Ridge. These are important landforms that we need to consider as far as preservation. These really kind of shape the idea of this landscapes plan, and there's definitely considerations for pieces of that topography. For example, steep slopes is an important aspect to identify within the municipality. What's shown on the map here are slopes that are over 15% grade, and really the importance of steep slopes, identifying your steep slopes and having a mechanism to preserve steep slopes is, if development occurs on some of these slopes, it makes them very susceptible to erosion. They're not very stable. So a lot of times municipalities will develop a steep slope ordinance that prevents any type of development on slopes of this grade or higher. And they also, if you can kind of think back to the map before, usually these are areas that can support some of our larger stands of trees because they are undeveloped or they are unsuitable for agriculture. The other thing to consider with topography is how streams form and how stormwater flows downhill. So when we look at kind of our steeper areas, we also need to consider runoff as far as where that's going. That kind of takes us into hydrology. These are all of the water features in the township. We like to think of water as more of a connected network. Everything flows into a stream somewhere. So the areas that we'll cover are streams, riparian areas, floodplains, and really ponds or wetlands. Streams are obviously the flowing body of water. We have really two major streams in the area, the Jordan Creek and the Cedar Creek, but we have three watersheds that the township is in. In the northern part of the township, all of that flows eventually into the Copley Creek. And then we talk a lot about the Jordan Valley, everything flowing into the Jordan Creek and the main stem of the Jordan flowing west-east through the township. And then we have two branches of the Cedar Creek that are part of the Little Lehigh Creek watershed. When we talk about streams, there's really kind of three categories that we would like to consider, with those categories having different mechanisms for water quality management: perennial streams, intermittent streams, and ephemeral streams. So perennial streams are what we consider our streams that we see every day, Jordan Creek Greenway, or the Jordan Creek, for example. Continuous base flow. These are sourced by groundwater, so they're always flowing, and we can see the streams flowing. The water flows above the stream bed. Perennial streams are probably the most complex to consider for conservation preservation because they have the existing water that's there, they have the surrounding land use, and we also need to consider the groundwater source. Intermittent streams, these are streams that flow at least once a year, typically in the winter and spring, and they're usually fed by a precipitation event, in some cases snow melt. Intermittent streams, they can have different characteristics of their stream bed. Sometimes you'll see them very clearly with the stream channel, but it might seem dry throughout most of the year until you get a storm. Sometimes it's more where the flow comes to a low point, and you'll start to see the stream bed form only when there's water in place. These are very important. These are really the headwaters that go into our larger and tributaries that go into our larger streams. And so, again, everything flows downhill. If these are compromised, it certainly affects the larger waterway. And then our ephemeral streams, these are really streams that are very rarely wet. It's usually more of a channel in major storm events. These are areas where you can start to see stormwater directed a low point on a property. The important thing here is these are not sourced by groundwater. It's really just overland flow. So when we talk about streams and we talk about our mechanisms used to protect our streams, I think it's important to look at our waterways and start to categorize what waterways we have in these different categories and develop different mechanisms to do that, whether it's looking at the riparian area or looking at construction practices that can influence these streams. We've kind of mentioned riparian area a lot. For those that are less familiar with this term, it's the area directly adjacent to the stream bed. And it's ideally supposed to be a combination of trees, shrubs, perennial plants. You can see in the graphic down below, this is a very functional and beneficial buffer would have different zones of what's in it. So you can see down here, you have kind of your stable vegetation and trees. And a lot of this is really the benefits of having a very developed buffer with a lot of vegetation. This really stabilizes the stream bank. So when we talk about erosion, and especially with storms that come through, by really planting trees and hardy vegetation there, we're actually protecting our stream bank and eliminating some of the erosion that can happen. The larger a buffer, the further it gets from the stream bed itself, the more functionality it has to actually filter what gets into it. So when we consider practices of land uses beyond the stream bed and beyond that buffer, all of the excess nutrients and sediments and anything that is flowing overland before it gets into the stream, it's actually going through that buffer. So it acts kind of like a filter. So again, the more vegetation there, the more it's filtering out the things that we don't want in our streams. And the other major benefit is that this provides shade, shelter, and food for fish and wildlife. If you look at the picture here, this is a great example of a stream bank that was severely eroded, did not provide much habitat at all for aquatic creatures, and really everything that was in that farm field next to it flowed right into the creek. You can start to see some of the growth of the buffer that was planted there. And now this is certainly it's a winter picture and a spring picture, but you can start to see how that creek will be a little bit more shaded and can support more species in that creek. And along with that comes all of the other pieces of providing more food for the different types of animals that are in the creek or going to the creek. Chris, I don't know if you want to add anything about kind of the importance of buffers. Okay. Floodplains, this is really as defined by FEMA. This is an area, any land area susceptible to being inundated by floodwaters from any source. Floodplains are very important from a regulatory standpoint. FEMA gets involved in floodplains by designating our flood zones so they can look at homeowners insurance requirements and provide guidance for building restrictions, avoiding areas that building in areas that could be flooded. There's really two categories that FEMA maps. There's the special flood hazard area. These are considered high risk. For flooding, there's a 1 in 4 chance that you'll see some type of flooding within a 30-year period. They use this 30-year period because of the 30-year mortgage. Really, this affects your homeowner's insurance, and this is the main reason for FEMA to look at, map, and regulate the floodplains. And this special flood hazard area also requires flood insurance. Just beyond that, areas that are still at risk for flooding, but maybe not as frequently, are considered non-special flood hazard areas. I believe this is what we consider our 100-year floodplain, 500-year floodplain. It's recommended to have flood insurance, but it's not required. You can see from the map, we certainly have large floodplains, especially along the Jordan Creek. This is primarily due to the low flat elevation through there, the lack of maybe buffers in certain locations, and I think we've all seen the impacts of flooding in the township. So certainly something to consider, not just the waterway itself, but the area around that is impacted by the waterway. And the township participates in the National Flood Insurance Program. So any development that occurs within a floodplain, there needs to be a floodplain permit issued by the township prior to that. The other piece of hydrology, a very important piece, are what we consider as wetlands. The EPA defines wetlands as areas where water covers the soil or is present either at or near the surface of the soil, really any time of the year. Below is a great example of a wetland. It's areas that it's not really a pond or an open standing body of water, but it has that woody vegetation. It has sometimes it can be very shallow. Sometimes it can have different sources of what's feeding it to create the wetland. There are a lot of ecological benefits to wetlands, including water storage, certainly water filtration, as we kind of talked before about the riparian buffer and being that filter for overland flow before it gets into our streams. Wetlands do a fantastic job of kind of being that filtration point for excess nutrients and things that we don't want in our waterways. And there are a lot of benefits for biodiversity. I think you can see in this picture, there might be a bird box down here. It supports a lot of different species. Wetlands are great to have. Wetlands are also regulated on a federal level. You can see a scattering of wetlands on the map here. And we're fortunate, we actually do have some pretty unique wetlands that we'll talk about in a little bit. Does anyone have any questions on hydrology or some of the things that we talked about earlier, water, before we kind of get into how all these pieces come together? Okay. So one of the things that we like to talk about is habitat. Habitat's a word that's thrown out a lot of times. I think sometimes people understand what it is, sometimes people don't. Really, I believe there's four main pieces, four main elements to what creates habitat. and that's food, water, shelter, and space. These are things that all animals need, all plants need as well, maybe just on a smaller level, and all humans need. I'd like to hand it over to Chris Kocher, president of Wildlands Conservancy, to talk a little bit more about the importance of habitat conservation, the ways we can conserve habitat, and kind of the connections between that.
Thanks for having me here today. As Chris mentioned, I'm Chris Kocher, the president of Wildlands Conservancy. And Wildlands is all about habitat. We're a land trust. We've been working for the past 50 years to protect natural resources in the region. I'm thrilled that the township is going through this exercise because planning at the municipal level is so important for the protection of our natural resources. At the same time, that planning effort, you also need to look beyond the township's borders as well. We talk about habitat and habitat connectivity. Chris had touched on a couple of key factors when it comes to looking at the natural resources in a municipality and the importance of having them connected together. And here's a slide of it's great if you have a piece of protected property, but ecologically, from a biodiversity perspective, that becomes so much more important if it's connected to another piece ecologically. And as we look at South Whitehall Township and the wonderful natural resources that are here, there's other landscapes that go beyond the township's borders that if the planning can incorporate those in, you'll get significant benefits both from an ecological perspective and recreational perspective, a quality of life perspective, and a quality of place perspective. Chris reminded me of a joke. Chris had worked for Wildlands for about a decade before, unfortunately, he came here, but I still love him, and I'm glad he's here. But if you can envision that on the lower connectivity slide, on Saturday night, there's a squirrel, and he wants to go see another squirrel across the valley. And there's no way to get there, right? And these corridors, these stream corridors, these forested corridors, these ridges are so important. These floodplains are so important to provide that opportunity for connectivity and increased biodiversity. Those connections allow organisms and animals to migrate. They allow them to get areas safely. We talk about the importance of corridors when it comes to mortality along roads and wildlife. These corridors are critically important to make sure that those things are in place. So anytime we can get things connected together ecologically, it's more important, and obviously from a quality of life and quality of place perspective, it's more important as well. So when you're looking at planning the open spaces and natural features, keep in mind the larger landscape, keep in mind the concepts of connectivity, keep in mind what's happening around other areas and what natural features they have. For example, to the east of South Whitehall Township is Whitehall Township, and the Jordan Parkway is there, and that's a pretty large core habitat of forested habitat. And to be able to connect into the Jordan Creek Greenway and follow that corridor to your west, you have another large landscape in the Trexler Nature Preserve. So South Whitehall Township is really the conduit between those two very important areas ecologically. And I think Chris, right on cue, has a slide up about some of those core and critical natural habitats. The natural areas, heritage areas, is identification of areas that have been identified as having significant ecological value. In Lehigh, Northampton counties, there's about 117 of these areas that have been identified. Many of those are in areas, again, with high conservation value. Typically, we see those in large forested tracts. We see them on ridge tops. We see them on floodplains. So when you think about where those are, how do you buffer those, and then more importantly, how do you connect those into the larger landscape? And the concept of a supporting landscape as well is important, because you may actually protect property to buffer land use away from one of those core habitats and one of those critical natural areas, even though you don't necessarily have that species of concern residing there. It may be important to buffer land use away from that as well. So the natural heritage inventories are a great way to identify those locations where really special things exist within the township.
Yeah, I think it's, as Chris mentioned, there's a number of these in the Lehigh Valley, and I think it's really cool that there is one already in the township. identified, and that there's really, you can see kind of the expanse there of that where the number 2 is on the screen. That's another identified area around Jordan Creek Parkway in Whitehall Township. But that large area surrounding it, that just shows that the supporting landscape for these critical habitats is pretty large. And that it goes back to that connectivity standpoint from, we're not just connecting the one piece, but we're kind of looking at the buffers around or the connections to something else. And I think the other thing to consider here is these natural heritage areas are identified through on the ground field work, or maybe some mapping tools and piecing together some layers to see what could support certain types of habitats, whether it's animal species or sensitive plant species. There's still some that are unknown. So these inventories, I think they're looked at maybe every 10 to 15 years or something like that. But a lot of times the scientists involved in this, they work with the best that they have. So it's something important to consider for protection, but it's also something important to consider what else is out there that we may not be fully aware of when we're looking at, especially how species move, and with looking at either planting certain areas or habitat management can attract certain species. Actually, I don't know, Chris, do you want to talk a little bit about maybe some of the habitat management work that you guys have done, maybe not necessarily here or at some of your nature preserves and things like that, to give an idea of like species coming back to a certain area?
Sure. When we think about, the Lehigh Valley and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania today versus, let's say, 20, 30, 40, even 50 years ago, obviously there's been substantial changes in our landscape, right? So the available green space and the available natural habitat becomes that much more important, right? And as we look at the changes even our forests have had over that same 50 to 100 year time span, I mean, at one point, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania was about 98% forested. In fact, there's actually more forested acres now in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania than there was at the turn of the century. But our forests have been besieged by any number of different threats, whether it be the chestnut blight or the emerald ash borer or the hemlock woody adelgid, or the list goes on and on of things that have attacked our native species. Couple that with the influx of invasive species that have come to take over many of our landscapes and many of our own backyards. The importance of managing our open spaces and protected natural areas has never been more important, because these are the areas that are left. So we want to increase to the greatest degree the conservation value and the biodiversity potential of those areas. And in many cases, nature's great. She does a wonderful job, but sometimes we need to do a little bit of help. So Wildlands, we have 14 nature preserves, totaling about 3,000 acres, protected about 60,000 acres of open space, have conservation easements on about 96 properties, totaling about 8,000 acres. And many of those acres under our control, the 3,000, we have active management taking place to remove invasive species, to plant the right species, to provide habitat for certain species of special concern. For example, up at the Thomas Darling Nature Preserve, which is about 1,500 acres up in Blakesley in the Poconos, there was a whole area of beech that was affected by the beech bark blight or beech bark disease. So we actually went in there and cut down about 90 acres of beech trees, because once the beech trees are infected, what happens is they shoot up all these little beech trees, right? So here's the big beech tree, and all around are all these little beech saplings. And you think, well, that's good. It's green, right? Nature's good when it's green. But the reality is it totally takes over the forest floor. There's not a lot of biodiversity associated with that. So we actually went in there, removed that affected beech, and then went back in and fenced that area, and then replanted it with native plant species. In addition to that project, in cooperation with that, was a habitat project to actually cut down the forest to make early successional forest habitat. As I mentioned to you before, there's more forested acres in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania today than the turn of the century. Unfortunately, much of that forest is the same forest type, right, and the same forest age. So what we have lost is that early successional forest habitat, and there's several species of concern here in the Commonwealth and throughout the Northeast that rely on that early successional habitat. So here we are, a land trust that's protected 60,000 acres of open space, and we cut down a bunch of trees to create habitat for specific birds. So the golden winged warbler and Silurian warbler are two in particular that reside half of the time down in the Amazon and central rainforest and come up into the Poconos to breed, and they breed in early successional forest habitat types. So by going in there and creating areas like that, we increase the likelihood of those species coming back to those areas. Couple that with additional work there in the northern flying squirrel, which also is very threatened here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And trust me, I got all the phone calls. Chris, I think I got northern flying squirrels in my attic. Oh, trust me, you don't. Those are the southern flying squirrels, which are actually pretty ambiguous. But the northern flying squirrels aren't. So again, doing active forest management to enhance the likelihood of those species coming in and residing there and increasing the biodiversity. So, in general, there's a lot that we do and a lot we all can do to enhance the ecological value of our natural areas, because again, they are becoming less and less, and we need to make sure that the ones that are available have the highest conservation value, and they're connected to the most amount of diverse landscapes as possible. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a great transition into, we talked a lot about the what of our natural resources, and we're going to kind of dive into the who. And as Chris mentioned, there's a lot that we can do. And there's a lot of partners out there. There's a lot of resources. There's a lot of people that we can work with as a municipality to preserve our natural resources. Here's just a kind of a very, very brief list of some of the government agencies out there, federal and state, working even with our local agencies. And it's important to remember that there is a lot of assistance available. We can do so much as a municipality, but we have state agencies, really the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. This is where our Bureau of Forestry is located. So from our state foresters, there's a lot of resources that we can tap into for technical assistance. There's also the Bureau of Recreation and Conservation, which we look for as far as grants to help manage some of the habitat types that we've talked about, looking into watershed conservation. We also look into these grants for a lot of our recreational work here at the township. The Department of Environmental Protection, very key into water quality protection. There's a lot of grants available there to look at what we can do to whether it's planting buffers or improving our streams and waterways. And then really there's just a lot of other partners. The Lehigh County Conservation District, for example, there's really kind of two sides to the district. There is the regulatory side, but there's also the water quality and watershed and habitat side. The Conservation District has worked with the township on planting pollinator gardens and things like that. And we also look at what can we do from some water quality projects. All of this, the conservation world is very robust, but it's also very small, I think you would say. And there's a lot of partners, and everybody really works together. Wildlands is a great resource here from a technical perspective, from a project partner perspective. Chris kind of talked about the land preservation work. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about maybe how you've gotten involved with municipalities as far as land preservation. We certainly, part of the influence for the South Whitehall Landscapes plan has been to look at land preservation and preserving our remaining open spaces here in the township. We're looking at a variety of ways of doing that, and certainly we're open to all kinds of ideas. So I don't know if you want to kind of give a little bit about what is a land trust and how you work as a nonprofit agency with some others.
Yep. Technically, Wildlands Conservancy is a land trust. We do other things besides just our land trust work, but our land trust work is the core function of our activity. And we take on the responsibility of managing and maintaining properties or rights of properties in perpetuity. When I say rights of properties, I'm talking about our conservation easements. Individuals can donate or we can purchase the right to develop their property. And as a land trust, we hold on to that right forever. When I talked about the 8,000 acres that we have under conservation easement, Those acres we don't own, we will never own, but we have and hold on to the right to develop that property. That's one of the tools that exists as a land trust to protect open space. Obviously, fee simple acquisition is one of those as well, where we go in there and purchase a piece of property. Of the 60,000 acres that Wildlands has protected, only 3,000 acres we own in those 14 nature preserves. 8,000 is under conservation easement. The remainder of that, 49,000 or so, is property that we transferred to create state parks and state forests, national U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service properties, municipal parks, you name it. Wildlands has enabled those agencies to own and manage that property. Wildlands has the ability to get grant dollars from many of those organizations there, both at the federal and state level. We match that with local dollars and local support, and they're able to purchase those properties that, quite frankly, wouldn't be able to be purchased and protected forever without the involvement of Wildlands or similar land trusts and nonprofits. So we play a really great role in enabling and working with broad-based partnerships to facilitate additional preservation. I would say about 35 of those 49,000 acres now reside with the Pennsylvania Game Commission. Pennsylvania Game Commission owns about 1.5 million acres of natural habitat here in the Commonwealth. Much of it here in Lehigh, Northampton counties is located on the Kittatinny Ridge or Blue Mountain. And I've joked for years that Wildlands is the organization that made the Blue Mountain green. About 13,000 acres of our land protection work has been focused on that landscape alone, because we talked about before about connectivity and the importance of landscape protection. This is a landscape that goes from Maine to Georgia over 2,100 miles. And it's in some places about, let's say, 2,000 feet high. So it has a lot of diversity when it comes to habitat. So it becomes really important from a habitat preservation perspective. So there's a lot of different ways that Wildlands can work with both municipalities and counties and state agencies to help forward preservation opportunities. We have several contracts with both Lehigh and Northampton counties to assist them with land preservation work. We also have contracts with several municipalities here in Lehigh, Northampton County as well, where we go in and we assist them in their land preservation goals by providing technical guidance, land preservation planning, as well as physically doing the land preservation deals and the conservation easements. We've also been very successful in helping communities get the resources that are needed to do open space preservation. The Green Futures Fund of about maybe 12 or 14 years ago was a Lehigh Valley-wide initiative to pass a bond to allow for open space preservation dollars. Wildlands was very instrumental in getting that passed. If you read just to the north of us here, back in November, Carbon County passed a bond initiative, a $10 million bond initiative by a margin of 82%, which is the highest percentage of any bond initiative in the country ever as far as passage. And Wildlands was the key architect behind ensuring that that $10 million was available to match farmland preservation dollars and other open space dollars. So yeah, we consider ourselves a great partner for many communities here throughout the Lehigh Valley and up into the Poconos to make sure that we can help them implement their land protection vision and help to create a Lehigh Valley that has wonderful natural places and continues to be a wonderful place to live, work, and play.
Thanks, Chris. One of the things that you have written down, that's written down here, is habitat management. One of the conversations we have quite a bit in the municipality is, if a subdivision comes in and there's an open piece of open space dedication, what is the maintenance plan for that? What is the management plan for that? Does it have to be mowed and maintained? Is there guidance available, or is that something that Wildlands does where you can help a municipality kind of understand best management practices to keep these dedicated open space areas kind of in a natural form as opposed to like a manicured lawn?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. We've done quite a bit of that work. Has anyone ever been to the Trexler Nature Preserve? Right, remember the just hillsides of autumn olive that were there? It's invasive species. We went in with our partners at the Game Commission and Lehigh County and basically cut that down and replanted natural habitat there, warm season grasses. We work also with several municipalities on no-mow zones and creating natural habitat in suburban landscapes, as I mentioned before, the remaining open spaces we have become that much more important to provide the ecological value. And there's many things that we can do in our backyards, as I'm sure we'll hear in a few minutes from Marie, and in other public spaces to maximize the value of that natural area, to increase the biodiversity, increase the habitat, and increase the value towards conservation. So absolutely, we have great examples all throughout the Lehigh Valley of where we work with municipalities to alter management and or do plantings or other activities, again, all designed to increase not only the conservation value, but in a lot of cases, the aesthetic value of those areas as well.
Yeah, I mean, I can kind of add, kind of transition between both the seeing it from the municipal side and seeing it from the from Wildlands perspective. I know that there's certainly been some great success stories of conversations about what constitutes good habitat management, and then a lot of that influencing maybe looking from the site review perspective and things like that when developments come in and looking at it, and even going to, I know one of the things that we're considering is reviewing our zoning ordinance and reviewing our subdivision land development ordinance and looking at what's required. And there's a lot of cases where good habitat management can kind of fit into those pieces, and maybe requiring certain things and not requiring certain things.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I guess I can also make as well, is that, again, nature does a wonderful job, but sometimes you just can't say, well, we're just going to leave this go because there's so many invasive species and other threats into that area that even though it's somewhat protected in there, it doesn't have the highest conservation value. So to have the resources and the wherewithal to actively manage those areas to increase the conservation value is really where you're going to get the biggest bang, from a acre per acre conservation value. Again, those are things that we can, help the township with and have helped many other townships in the past. So yeah, you try to get as much as you can from an ecological perspective on what you have the ability to manage and maintain, and even some simple things as not mowing as much grass and no-mow zones and warm season grasses and other types of things, native vegetation requirements for developments and those types of things can go a long way to add significant conservation value to our landscape.
So I think that's a great transition from, we talk about what we can do as a municipality, what we can do with some of our partners available. But the other piece of the who, as I mentioned earlier, is really you as the residents, and what can you do on your properties. The township only owns so much land, only regulates so much land as things come through as from a development perspective. But we also need to consider what we do as homeowners, what we do in our daily lives to consider preserving our natural resources. Just a quick, a couple of items here of things that we can do or consider is just monitoring our water usage and monitoring our waste, energy consumption. Planting trees. Planting trees is a very easy, great contributor as native trees, I should mention. To increasing biodiversity, adding to help with climate change and carbon sequestration. And really the final one comes down to property stewardship. Marie North is here. Marie is a resident of the township. Marie has been involved with the Green Advisory Council since its inception. And as we transition to the Environmental Advisory Council, I have met Marie. We talked about a lot of the partnerships and resources out there. I met Marie through the Lehigh Valley Greenways Partnership years ago. And we are very blessed to have her in our township, and as someone who cares about this and is an advocate and very vocal about the resources that we have here. So I'll hand it over to Marie to kind of talk about what she has done as a resident and landowner to help preserve what she can in her backyard.
Let me just make sure I've got good sound here. Yes? No? Yes? Okay, good. First thing I want to say is that I'm excited to participate in this, but also I'm honored to be up here with these individuals who know so much and I'm always learning, and I attend a lot of conferences and workshops, so I'm constantly absorbing. My husband does the same thing in regard to what I'm going to be talking about this evening. But when I'm with people like this, I'm always like, oh, I'm with my people again, which is a good feeling because you can't always talk forest stewardship or the various things that we do on our property with people that are going to understand exactly what it is you're doing. And there are times and places when we want to educate the people about what we do. But to have a general conversation with some of the people, they don't understand what we're talking about. So we have to break it down. So it's occasionally it's very refreshing, and it refreshes me and what I do to be with, like I said, my people. So as Chris said, I live here in the township. I'm involved with a variety of organizations. But in this case, I'm here tonight to talk about our little stewardship forest in South Whitehall Township, and we are probably the only one in the township. What is a stewardship forest? Let me backtrack a little bit and say we own only 2.5 acres. So when I say we're tiny, we're tiny. But we are part of a larger 5 to 7 acre tract, and the rest of the land is another landowner. So we're forested. Obviously, we are a mix of hardwoods. We have white oak, black oak, shagbark hickory, mockernut, pignut hickory, hackberry, lesser amounts of red maple and black cherry, and we do still have some ash trees. The reason I mention the species that we have is all of those species in some way support either birds, insects, caterpillars, all of these things that are very important to this whole ecosystem. So what is a stewardship forest, and why did we do it? When we first purchased this property in 2004, I approached our service forester in Lehigh County because I knew that each county had a service forester. And I said, please come out and look at this property and tell us what we can do. And he came out, and immediately somewhere I had learned about stewardship forest. And I said, well, we want to be a stewardship forest. And he's like, okay, but at that point you had to be 10 acres or more to be a stewardship forest. And I'm like, but we really want to do this. And so with him discussing things with us and seeing our enthusiasm and adoring the property, he's like, we'll find a way to make you a stewardship forest. And so we did become one, but now what we are learning is that in Pennsylvania, the majority of forest landowners that are not part of a state or federal program own 10 acres or less. And so all of a sudden, we are very important because as Chris was talking about, we're considered an urban forest, but we provide a lot of ecological benefits to not just ourselves, but to our neighborhood and to the community. One of the things I wanted to talk about is, this was very exciting to us. We have been watching the bat population on our property. And I'm sure you've heard that bats are in decline. I'm hearing that perhaps some of them are coming back. And we watch them every summer, right before nightfall. And for the past few summers, we see at most about 4 or 5 in a little clearing area on our property. And they're hard to count because they're zipping around. Well, the other night, we saw about 8 to 10 bats altogether. So we were thrilled to see this. How does this relate to the forest? We have shagbark hickory. Shagbark hickory has flaps. The bark has like flaps to it. And bats can go underneath that bark and protect themselves under the bark and roost under there. So we're thinking that's what some of the bats are doing. So our shagbark hickory becomes very important. The other thing we've learned is that we are a migratory stop. When Chris talked about the core forests, the large tracts, if any of you have ever seen a little, oh golly, the name escapes me at the moment. I'll get back to that. But they're a bird that appreciate the scarlet tanager. They have to have a core forest, a large forest, but they are migrating. And they're going up into perhaps northern Pennsylvania, New York. I'm not sure exactly where their final stop is, but they are stopping in our forest. They are taking their break there on the migratory route. So we have the protection for them. We have a water source. We have food. And so to see this every spring, to see these migratory birds making a stop is fantastic. And some of them stay in our forest. So let me give you about some forest facts. I think we can move to the next slide. Okay, this is the photograph of our forest in the fall. What's interesting is, in addition to the 10 acres or less, in Pennsylvania, 70% or 12 million acres are privately held by approximately 750,000 landowners. And that means landowners like me. So what we do on these forests is extremely important. My husband and I attend a conference every 2 years that Penn State offers, the Private Forest Landowners Conference. And again, we're like sponges. We absorb, like I'm absorbing tonight, what these people are putting out there. And we've learned so much. Without them, we would not know what we know. When we purchased our property in 2004, I talked about the service foresters. But then we were going to build, and some of you who've been past the property, you know we have a home there. What trees were we going to save? What trees what area could we best build in so that we are not taking away trees that might be of value to habitat or to birds or whatever. So we gave it a lot of thought. And so all of this was an important part of what we are doing. And in addition to the service forester, we had loggers, we had a consulting forester, we had a vegetation survey done, which is over there. There's a copy of it on the table if you'd like to take a look at it. And that was done by a local couple here in the Lehigh Valley who came in to tell us, what type of vegetation do you have here? Is any of it sensitive vegetation? Is there anything that should be protected here? And so that was helpful to us as well as to what we did with the property. We also had agreements with the landowner, and that is not typical and something I wanted to bring up with the township tonight. The individual we bought this property from has farmland below us and various spots around us. Our forested piece was part of his property. We had in our agreement with him that if our land did not perk to a standard septic system, we would not want to buy it. And he was in agreement with that because the forest was so beautiful, there was no way we wanted to put a sand mound in there. Putting a sand mound in would have required a lot of trees to be taken down. And that wasn't what we wanted. So he was fine with that. We also said that if there were sinkholes, and we had test borings done, again, where we wanted to put the property, if there were if the test boring showed that we were not hitting a hard surface, if these borings were going down and into the soil very deeply, well, then we're thinking, no, we probably don't want this property, and he was okay with that. We also talked about how we would protect his farmland from any kind of runoff from building, which was very important to him. So all of that was discussed and in a contract with him, showing respect for this owner. And I think those types of things can be done as well. Still today, tree protection. And we've talked about, I think that when I talk with people who have homes that have been built or seen them built in the Lehigh Valley, and for a long time, the practice was, well, let's cut all the trees down to put these homes in. And then the people put landscape trees in that are nowhere near the size of the trees that were cut down. So we found out, again, from our service forester, how to build with mature trees, how to protect those trees. And Tim Dugan who's on your planning commission, who is also a forester. I'm trying to fill in for him as best I can tonight because he's so knowledgeable. But he was the one who helped us with that. And so all of our trees were protected from heavy machinery, heavy equipment. So it can be done. And we didn't lose a tree. We just by putting orange construction fence around. Let's see, let's move to the next one. The invasives, as Chris Kocher spoke about, are a very big problem, and we deal with them on an almost constant basis. This is what is called Japanese stiltgrass. Once it moves in and it takes over quickly. We use a variety of methods to treat that, some of them being just putting cardboard down and covering it with mulch, a heavy layer of mulch to kill the stiltgrass, but also to prevent seeds from coming up the next spring. It buys us time, and it has been very, very successful to use cardboard. Now, we don't use a laminated cardboard. This is plain cardboard being put down. Occasionally, we do use an herbicide. It's used very carefully, very judiciously, a lot of times with an eyedropper or a paintbrush when we cut stems. And so you will see my husband out there with the dropper and the paintbrush so that we are not affecting anything else around there, just trying to kill some of this stuff that has taken over. When Chris Kocher said it's a big problem, it's a huge problem. Invasive species are a huge problem. Okay, let's go to the next one. Okay, I'd like to talk a little bit about native landscaping. People say that, are wondering about this. Can I use native plants? What's it look like? This is native landscaping at our house using shredded leaves as a mulch. And the shredded leaves are so valuable for the nutrients that they provide. And that's going to provide a lot more for your native plants than some of the mulch that you would go out and buy, and you're not quite sure where that's coming from. Sometimes it's shredded pallets, this type of thing, you don't really know. So we're trying to give our plants a good start, and many of them being forest type plants. So they appreciate this, and they have done it. Some of them done extremely well with the shredded leaves. Okay, Chris, next one. Okay, this is our pollinator garden. And stiltgrass and other invasives were in this area, covered it with cardboard, and then put plants in individually, and to see what would happen the following year. And it turned out great. This is a picture of just a part of it. It was a large area, and so these are all native plants that you're seeing here, which is attracting hummingbirds, all type butterflies, all types of things that you would expect. Bees, a lot of bees from a pollinator garden. Okay, and our next one, stormwater runoff. This area had grass that we had planted, a no-mow grass, a fine fescue. Stilt grass came in and completely covered it and killed basically the grass that we had, because it was a mat of it. Anyone that knows what stilt grass is about knows what it can do. It was a mat. So come winter time, we had heavy rains, we had snow melt, excuse me, and this is what our property looked like on the east side. And we knew we had to do something. So we consulted with a variety of people here in the valley who would help us design a rain garden to put in there. That was our hope, to control some of this water. So the next one will show you, this is just a portion, okay? We have a pond here, we have a bird pond and a wildlife pond, and that's only about 6 inches of water. To the right of the plants is a smaller pond called a stilling pond. And to the right of the stilling pond are still more native plants. So when the water that you saw rushing down that hillside comes and hits these plants, they're water absorbing plants. And so they are absorbing as they go down. The water is traveling through, hits the stilling pond where it dips down and slows it down a bit before it goes into the wildlife pond and the bird pond. So again, we've stopped a lot of erosion. We've added native plants where the water is able to penetrate into the soil, recharge the aquifers, there's so many good things that happen with the rain gardens. And so this has turned out to be a success for us. Even in the winter, this system works pretty well. Do we have one more? Okay, yeah, that's it. The only thing I wanted to say is a couple of other things. The stewardship plan, and I don't think I was clear enough on that. The stewardship plan is not something that's forced on you. You contact your service forester and say you would like to do it. And he comes out and he helps you decide what are your priorities. And then I'm giving you a very simple explanation. What are your priorities for your property? What is it that you would like to see here and what you would like to do? And then they put the plan together. And in our case, our service forester did it. Excuse me, puts a plan together, provides you a ton of information, and you can go through there and look at what he's suggesting, and he's working along with you. And then they will visit you every year. They will visit you a couple times a year to see how you're doing. Do you have any questions? Do you need any help with anything? So we're not forced to do it. We volunteer to do it. We are registered with the U.S. Forest Service, but the service forester through DCNR here in Pennsylvania is the person that comes out and takes a look at what we're doing and helps us accomplish the things that we would like to do for that property. And on a final note, Pennsylvania every year does a program called, or a walk, I should say, a walk in Penn's Woods. And it's the first Sunday in October every year. It's usually in the afternoon. We haven't done it in a while, but we are considering doing it again this year. They like to have at least one forest in every county. So we are considering doing that. So if you'd like to know if our property is open, if you'd like to visit right here in the township, just look up Walk in Penn's Woods in the next few weeks and you'll see all of the counties that are all of the properties that are registered in Pennsylvania that you can go and visit. But then you'd have an opportunity to see what we do. I'm pretty sure we're going to do it, but I have to check. My husband has to look at his schedule a bit more. But yeah, keep an eye on that. Feel free to take a look at what I brought. I have it over there on the table. And I believe that's it. I don't know if anyone has any quick questions, or do you want to do that at the end?
I think we can take questions for you now, Marie. I just had a couple of comments. I think, first of all, thank you so much for kind of sharing your story with everyone, kind of bringing it back to, I think it was interesting for me to find out how you and your husband kind of got into all of this and not really knowing. I think I mentioned to you, usually, I've talked to a lot of people who love the spaces that they live in, and they have either, grown up on a farm or they studied forestry or it's their whole world. And I've just found it fascinating that Marie said, they kind of looked at this property, they wanted to do something right, and they kind of just rolled up their sleeves and they learned. And I think that's, I think it's a compelling story. I think it's something that usually the hardest part to get into this type of work is the not knowing where to go, who to ask. There's a number of resources out there. I know Marie shared a bunch of resources with me, and kind of similar to the last meeting that we talked about in agricultural resources, there's a really good kind of avenue the township can play to get residents connected with some of the resources that we have for people to preserve these types of things. The other thing I wanted to mention, I just kind of thought about when you had talked about your mulch there with leaves. One of the things that we often, we forget, we think about doing all of this work is the cost for it, and that it might be more expensive to do. A lot of cases that, the core behind a lot of this work, a lot of this preservation work, is nature really is cyclical, and nature kind of helps itself. So when you think about the idea of reusing some of what's around you for mulch instead of going to buy mulch, or the idea of composting and things like that. And we kind of talked earlier about sort of management strategies, and there's a lot of ways that we can save money by doing something that is better for the environment. So you're kind of saving the green in both ways.
Well, one thing I wanted to mention real quick, Chris, is that I did have a talk with Tim Dugan about my presentation tonight. And Tim wanted me to stress that, not everyone has a stewardship forest. Not everyone has a little forested area. But his thing was start with one thing, as Chris Kocher said, plant a native tree. Plant native plants where you can. Start that process. So we have Bradford pear, Callery pear in our neighborhood, which was an allowed tree before, now it's not. And that is a nightmare of a tree. So I am waiting for some of those trees to die so that some native street trees can be put in. But it's that type of thing. You don't have to tear out all your gardens. You don't have to redo everything, but start small, because that's certainly what we did. Start small and build up and learn as you go. And these types of things are wonderful for learning.
Does anyone have any questions about what Maria's done or some of the ideas we talked about as far as what you can do personally as we start to wrap up here? Monica? Yeah. Yeah.
Lose my train of thought. There we go. Is there a way to communicate with developers as land is developing and things are being built, that these are desirable and this is what we would like to see more of? Because often, I know in our case, the trees were not the right ones. They died. They got the girdling roots. A lot of them grew into each other. They were planted too close together, and it just was not the right landscape for the house. And I think that when you build, you want to put in something pretty, and you maybe don't think 10 or 20 years down the road what's going to happen to these trees. So is there some way to communicate that to new developments?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll say South Whitehall is fortunate that the Landscape and Shade Tree Commission, as they review development plans, so for those that are unaware, there's a Landscape and Shade Tree Commission of the Township, another board similar to Planning Commission and so forth. And this commission looks at the street trees in the township, but they also review land development plans and the landscaping associated with that. And the kind of required tree list has actually been pretty good compared to other municipalities. Looked at all native species and species that would thrive in these types of areas. I've seen certain municipalities, to the extent of kind of what we talked about earlier, getting more involved in the landscaping requirements as far as the land development process. It's tough. Sometimes you get a lot of pushback, but that is something that we can potentially look into in kind of our regulatory review process of looking at kind of having those no mow areas, buffer requirements, increasing buffer requirements where applicable, and I don't know. I mean, I just think some creative ideas of looking at by increasing biodiversity or supporting habitat, having some incentives there could be something to look into.
And just to piggyback on Chris's comment about incentives, one of the things in planning, and again, my planner toolbox, anytime we can incentivize what the township wants is the best way to get things to happen, because the incentives have to make sense, but having the developer see that, oh, if I do, I don't know, a forward stewardship program, I get this benefit. So that will make them actually think about it and pencil it out and decide whether it makes sense or not. So that's one of the things that we'll be looking at, is how can we incentivize some of these programs.
Chris had
a weed ordinance. We're talking about incentivizing some things, and I know I've gotten a lot of calls, from interested residents throughout the Lehigh Valley who want to do some of these habitat projects and want to do the right thing, but it's in conflict with the township's weed ordinance, and I know that those things have a place and it makes sense, but sometimes you can't do what you want to do from a habitat perspective because you wouldn't be allowed to do that.
We have a high weed and grass ordinance, and our code enforcement officer is very active with that. And one of the things I think Chris and I were talking about it earlier today is, how do we as a municipality, whether it's designate or how do we allow those areas to happen? Is there some sort of certification that if you have this area certified, then you're exempt from the high weeds and grass ordinance? I do know that our code enforcement officer has been to, and I forget who put it on, it was probably Penn State Extension, a class for municipalities and code enforcement to look at, pollinator gardens and, wilding of, neighborhood spaces or yards. So it's something that we've talked about and looked at and will probably show up as a recommendation in the plan.
And I think it's, and making that kind of clear distinction to just letting things go and to active management. And I think too that it's something that we'll really, try to highlight, especially in this chapter of the plan, is there's the preservation piece of it and what can we do to protect. But then with natural resources, without good management, you're really kind of hindering the resources that are there just by letting it go. In some cases, it is appropriate, but I think we'll need to certainly look at recommendations for us as a municipality and how we're managing our open spaces and suggestions to landowners to kind of take a page out of Marie's book here.
Well, one thing that's interesting, and some of you may have heard this quote, I heard this a number of years ago, and my pollinator garden looked very neat in that photograph. Right now, it's looking a little wild, but the quote is, nature likes a mess. Nature does not like the types of landscaping that you see where there's bush here, shrub here, shrub here, shrub here, and a lot of mulch. There's nothing there for them. And especially if it's a non-native shrub or tree, there's nothing there for them. So we understand nature likes a mess, but we also understand what we like. We try to make a balance there so that something that it looks somewhat attractive to us, but still gives them a lot of different size vegetation and this type of thing, because different insects, different little species, they want different things to hide in, or they would need different types of food. So we try to provide that, but we neaten it up a bit.
And always coming back to kind of like the geography of it, I think about that's really the purpose of this landscape planning, to identify those areas that we can try to incorporate better management strategies and preservation options so that we can kind of have that type of management where it's appropriate. And then we're also, allowing for, it's great if, there's one area that, might be left wild, but if there's nothing else around it, then it doesn't really serve the purpose, as we mentioned before. Unless anyone else, do you have some?
It just triggered. So when I was teaching at Temple, one of my students, I had a couple landscape architecture students, and one of her final projects was a GIS analysis to look at, she called it the milkweed way. So actually mapping locations for plantings of milkweed so that there was the corridor for the butterflies to go. So it was a pretty neat little project and a neat little paper. But talking about some of the things that Chris brought up about the connectivity and things that a municipality can do to kind of help point out where that connectivity is and where those opportunities are to create those corridors is something that we can look into.
Does anyone else have questions? Diane, yeah.
I do. That milkweed project might be something fun for an Eagle Scout project if anybody comes to the township asking for what we might like. My comment or question was to follow up on your comment earlier about incentivizing with developers with properties that are being developed. Will the township build in incentives for preserving healthy, mature trees on a property as opposed to clear cutting and just planting. I know that's something that's been brought up over the years on the Planning Commission, and we see large tracts of lands just totally change forever. Is there a way to build in open space, even if it's not developed into any type of recreational, but just keeping some of it not asphalt and forever it'll be green, whether it's wetland or if there's trees or.
Yes.
Okay.
You made a couple of the connections that we were trying to make tonight is, you know, if a developer comes in, most of the time is clear cut the area and then replant. It makes it easier for construction. But if we can, and there's methods that we can build in to the ordinance, if we have the, for example, suppose we identify woodlands on our official map. So then we have to start a conversation about how are they going to maintain or protect those woodlands. So there's, again, in that toolbox, there's a lot of tools. You know, and it also talks about the maintenance. And that was one of the things that I brought up is here at the township, you know, a lot of times taking on property, there's a maintenance responsibility. And what does that cost? And how do we as the township manage our open space or the open space that's dedicated? A lot of, well, the big project that we're looking at now is all homeowner association property, mostly because township didn't want maintenance responsibility. But if we have a clearer direction and a recommendation of how we can manage these open spaces, I think it's going to be more palatable for the township to take on that responsibility. And those are some of the things that we hope to build into the plan.
I think to add to that is kind of the idea of it's, and Chris mentioned it earlier, it's just the different levels of preservation when it comes to properties and even looking at even if the development is privately held, but if there were an easement held by the township or by a land trust that outlined those preservation values and ensured those preservation values, then that's a way that we could kind of get out of the private property what we're looking for without having the obligation for the maintenance and just the ownership of it.
And the other thing, just one quick comment to Diane's comment is a lot of times what people have found is if the developer is encouraged to save certain native trees that are larger and that are providing shade for the property, what I have heard from realtors and what I have read, mature trees on a property really increase the value. People want to live on a spot that has a mature tree or two. And if they're native trees and they're in good condition, it just makes a whole lot of sense, and it's going to sell that property a lot faster for the developer if there's mature trees.
Just to piggyback on that as well, Wildlands in cooperation with Lehigh Valley Planning Commission did a study about 5 or 6 years ago called Return on Environment, and it looked at data in Lehigh and Northampton counties and the value that the natural environment played and gave back to the economy of the region. And it was eye-opening. I mean, we always know nature's important, but now we're talking about the dollars and cents. And one of the key takeaways I'll share is that on average in Lehigh and Northampton counties, based on real data of real sales, if you were within a quarter mile of a trailhead or protected open space, your house sold on average for $15,000 more, right? So when you talk about the value of open space protection, the value of a plan like this, not only is it important for the environment, but it's also important for our economy as well. There was also $800 million worth of recreation value in fishing license and hunting licenses and binoculars and those types of things just in Lehigh and Northampton County alone. Significant benefits from an air quality and health perspective as well. And then a whole series of environmental services. We talk about cleaning water, riparian buffers, and flood mitigation and those types of things. We can actually put values on the trees and the natural environment specifically in Lehigh and Northampton County. Value it provided, I think, just over $2 billion of economic value directly derived from our natural resources.
It's kind of a funny juxtaposition that we're in here because, you know, we have this valuable open space here in the Lehigh Valley. We have, you know, these great natural resources, close proximity to outdoor recreation. And that's also the attraction for people to want to move here and to live here. And with that comes the pressure to develop more and for more people to come to this area. So you know, it's what we have to wrestle with in understanding, you know, what we have, preserving what we have, and ensuring that it's there forever. I don't really have a solution for it, but we're working on it.
So my other question is, this is going forward, that we want to do these incentives. Is there any hope for developments that are in the process right now through open communication and dialogue? Like as you're developing, you know, we would like to do this. We would like to save this. Is it a hopeless situation for what's already happening?
It's a lot harder to talk about something that's already gone through the approval process. But we can certainly reevaluate some of the open space areas and look at what the ultimate plan for them is. Because there may be opportunities to preserve some mature trees through, I mean, if there's walkways and paths throughout the development, there may be an opportunity to let's preserve these significant trees rather than just clearing it out, putting in the landscape center tree from the garden center down the street. So yes, we can certainly look into some of that. Yeah, and it needs to be done soon. Now that they're cranking out there. Yeah. Jacob had a question. You want to come up and grab a mic?
Yeah, I just had a couple of questions for Marie. I know you talked about the native landscaping. I know you mentioned the example of the shredded leaves and the flower beds. Are there any resources to advise homeowners about, you know, what options are out there for native landscaping? Does DCNR put anything out about that? You know, if a homeowner wants to start utilizing native landscaping, where should they look to learn more about it?
Okay, I did provide a list.
Yeah, I
For
apologize.
Chris.
Marie gave me a huge list to put in, and then I just thought maybe it's something we could distribute. So
Yeah.
I'm sure.
He has a list.
And,
Okay,
and
for you.
along those lines, are there any local businesses or landscaping companies that
Yes.
specialize in native
Yes,
landscaping?
absolutely. Absolutely. Am I allowed to mention them?
Please,
Yes, okay.
yeah.
Edge of the Woods Native Plant Nursery up on Route 100. I know those ladies. They've been doing that work for years. In fact, I think they worked at Wildlands for a while. Yes, Sue and Louise. Okay, so they are very, very knowledgeable about native plants, and a lot of my plants came from them. But a little known place that does landscaping, and their name does not lead you to think that, is Parkland Nurseries, and they are right here in the township. And Stacy Nash has just received some type of a certification or a master's, I think, in this type of landscaping. And they're the ones who helped us do our pond. Okay, Stacy was heavily involved in that and in the native plants that we put in. She's very, very knowledgeable. So Parkland Nurseries, Hoffmansville Road, I believe is where they're at. An excellent person to talk to.
Stacy also served on the board of directors of Wildlands
Oh,
Conservancy.
that's right. She was on your board. Yes, Stacy was on the board. Yeah, but yeah, great. Okay.
And my last question, obviously your property, based on what you've shared tonight, is a prime example of a wide variety of efforts between the rain garden, the pollinator garden, the stewardship forest, even just preserving mature trees while you're building your home. Talking about incentives, it's not just incentives that the township can offer to residents, but also red tape that needs to be cut. In all of your efforts with your ponds or your gardens, did you face any red tape from the township, either through zoning or the permitting process or code enforcement? What was that experience like, and what things would you recommend us potentially do away with?
Did you get any high weed and grass
No, I
violations?
did not. I love answering this question because when we told, I'm going to do this if you don't mind. I'm going to
Please. Yeah, no, I'm excited to hear the answer.
Yeah, excited to hear the answer. When my husband and I decided once we became empty nesters that we needed to move someplace else. And we were in South Whitehall Township. And we looked at a variety of townships, looked at a variety of places. And our questions were, well, do they have recycling? What else do they offer in this township? What about trash? And no one was meeting what South Whitehall does. And I think that was critical. That's a critical piece. We started looking back between 2000 and 2003, and we came back to the township. And then we started telling people how we're going to build a house in South Whitehall Township. And the response was, a couple of responses. Are you crazy? That ought to be interesting. Do you think you're really going to be able to do this? And especially when they found out we wanted to build sustainably. Okay, so our house, every product in our house was covered by the building code and what we wanted to do. So if you come out for the woodland tour, you will see our house and we can get more involved in that. But we met no red tape. Nothing. I mean, we had to mitigate that water. We put in a garden, and that the pond is not deep. The little waterway that's stones and plants, the stones you get at a landscape place, rocks we found on our property, and that goes through and mitigates the water. We haven't heard anything, but we keep the right of way mowed. Okay, that's a grass strip. We keep that mowed. And then you can see some native plants beyond that. But I have not heard anything from the township at all, nothing negative. So perhaps it's in the way we've done it. And also in our location. Our neighbors across the street have two little children, a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old. Their mom calls our property the Enchanted Forest. Mm-hmm. So when these kids talk to me about our property, well, in your Enchanted Forest, blah, 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 and they ask me questions. But isn't that a great idea to encourage children? I mean, they're fascinated with what we do. They want to learn more, and they do similar things on their property with flowers and this type of thing. But no one has ever called our property the Enchanted Forest. My husband and I might have called it that in private moments, but we have never heard anyone else call it that until these little children came along. So, yeah, but no, we didn't encounter, from building all the way through, we encountered no problems with the township. But I will say this, and I think residents need to know this. We knew to ask questions, and we also knew who to go to, if we needed to speak to someone in zoning. And my husband is very meticulous. I don't know how many people know him here. He's very meticulous. And so he would lay it out. This is what we want to do. This is how we want to do it. When it came to building, and they would look at it and be like, yeah, it meets our requirements. Okay. There was nothing, what's the word I want to use? We didn't do it roughshod. We tried to be respectful of the municipality, our neighbors, the individual we bought the property from, and talk, communicate. And so, yeah, no, it's a great question, but we encountered no problems. And I'm hoping the weed man does not. I'm hoping I don't hear from him, but I'll have to educate him as well.
What's your address again?
Yes. Well, that's another very interesting question. We are at North Farms, what is known as North Farms Estate. And when we first bought our property, and I don't want to take all your time here, but it's kind of humorous, the township didn't know where we were. Okay, the township officials working there did not know. They're like, well, where is that exactly? And they had to come driving up to see where we were. So North Farms Estate was approved by the township. It is a small subdivision, but the piece of property we bought was a separate piece of property, separate owner. The wooded property was separate. And so we could go to him and say, this is what we would like to do and what we would like to build and how we will treat this property and blah, blah, blah. And it was what he wanted to hear. When we talk about history next time, this is a very important piece. Some of these older people who have these historic properties still in, ownership of them, they want respect. They want to know that you will respect my story and what I own and what I'm offering to you, if I offer it to you. And him and his wife needed to know what our plans were and how we were going to treat that property. What were our ideas? They didn't want someone coming in there just cutting all the trees down and just getting crazy and not having any forethought as to how will that affect his farm field below. So it's being respectful, I think, was so key. And we wrote him a letter. We actually contacted him via letter. And later on, when he got to know us better, it was so sweet. He said, it's the nicest letter I've ever received from someone who wanted to buy his land. You know what I mean? He just couldn't believe the detail we went into. But that's how we went about it. I hope I've answered your question. I kind of digressed a bit.
So if no additional questions, it's a great segue into the next meeting. Next week, we have the Historic Resources meeting. We'll have Jeff Marshall here from, I forgot the name of his company. So Jeff will be here. We'll go through some, I don't know that we're going to get into actual resources, but how we're going to handle them.
There's a lot of resources to go
There's a lot.
through.
There's a lot. We've compiled a pretty big list. And Jeff's been working on that list as well. So we'll go through some categories and different ways that we can hopefully classify and manage and hopefully incentivize, again, some of the preservation for that. He's going to be here all day, hopefully.
Mm-hmm.
We have him scheduled to meet with some of the stakeholders and learn some stuff and visit some of the properties as well. So we're going to bring him up for the whole day and hopefully keep him busy. And we may have some other stuff to announce at that meeting. We're kind of finalizing a partnership that might.
I think we could share a little bit
Okay.
about it. I mean, so I want to kind of highlight just some things coming up beyond that. Yeah, tomorrow, kind of, it's week to week here with all the, there's a lot of preservation going on. Tomorrow, and as an extension of this meeting, we'll be down at Covered Bridge Park. This is a family-friendly event, a lot more interesting than tonight for everybody. Even though I found tonight to be extremely interesting, but yeah. So tomorrow night we'll be talking about the Jordan Creek Greenway, some of the plans there with the regional partnership, working with Wildlands, some of the other municipalities along the Greenway, kind of what's the future as this trail gets developed, talking about that, again, the landscape level preservation. And we'll be talking about watershed education and connecting kids and families and people with their local watershed and what is a watershed and how can you tell, what's great about the stream, how can you look at the stream. So that should be a fun event tomorrow evening down at the park. And then as Dave mentioned, we have our historic resources meeting here. There's going to be food trucks, Grub Night food truck, and Batch Micro Creamery. So I'm excited for that one. Always good to have food there as we're learning. One of the things that we're excited about, we talked early on in kind of the kickoff meeting to this of there's so much that we're not going to be able to get into in the short couple of months we're working on. There's so many people we need to talk to, and we want to kind of highlight some of those stories. We've had interest from the library right here to partner with us on this plan, and they see a huge benefit to identifying kind of our history. And They've offered to kind of help maybe some of our older residents work with some of the technology that we have available to kind of capture some of those stories, maybe fill out the landscape photo survey. And so we're excited to maybe see that happen towards the end of this plan and kind of maybe develop some strategies to look at how do we carry on the idea of collecting these stories beyond just this plan itself. And then, as Dave mentioned, we're looking to really wrap this thing up in October. And as we emphasized a lot, there's a lot of work that we need to do quickly to identify some of this. So with that, and if there's not any other questions, thank you everyone for coming out. Thank you for your interest and your participation. We really appreciate it. And we're excited to see where this goes.
And so we have the recording. We'll post that on the web page. I think we'll post some of the citizen guide information and some additional links and things will be posted on the website in the next couple of days. So check it out. Send friends to it to watch the video. If
Yeah, follow up to the last meeting, we had such a great interest on some of the like community level resources that from agricultural that we kind of developed maybe a subpage just for agriculture. We're going to continue to flesh that out, and we'll do the same with natural resources, historic resources, so that we have a place for people to come and interact and maybe fill out some of these surveys or enter information and kind of see where we're going with this plan.